Good morning. We're back on August 11th, 2021 to read about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook organized by Michael Malice. And we are reading in Chapter 20, Murray Rothbard from Anatomy of the State, 1994. And we're partway through the essay. And I'm going to jump us in and get reading. Start of page 298. Got to see if our air conditioner repair guy's here yet. Okay, here we go. Thus, the state has invariably shown a striking talent for the expansion of its powers beyond any limits that might be imposed upon it. Since the state necessarily lives by the compulsory confiscation of private capital, and since its expansion necessarily involves ever greater incursions on private individuals and private enterprise, we must assert that the state is profoundly and inherently anti-capitalist. In a sense, our position is the reverse of the Marxist dictum that the state is the, quote, executive committee of the ruling class in the present day, supposedly the capitalists. Instead, the state, the organization of the political means, constitutes and is the source of the, quote, ruling class, rather, ruling caste, and is in permanent opposition to genuinely private capital. We may therefore say with de Juvenel, quote, only those who know nothing of any time but their own, who are completely in the dark as to the manner of powers behaving through thousands of years, would regard these proceedings, nationalization, the income tax, etc., as the fruit of a particular set of doctrines. They are, in fact, the normal manifestation of power, with a capital P, and differ not at all in their nature from Henry VIII's confiscation of the monasteries. The same principle is at work, the hunger for authority, the thirst for resources, and in all of these operations the same characteristics are present, including the rapid elevation of the dividers of the spoils. Whether it is socialist or whether it is not, power must always be at war with the capitalist authorities and despoil the capitalists of their accumulated wealth. In doing so, it obeys the law of its nature. What the state fears. What the state fears above all, of course, is any fundamental threat to its own power and its own existence. The death of a state can come about in two major ways. A, through conquest by another state, or B, through revolutionary overthrow by its own subjects, in short, by war or revolution. War and revolution, as the two basic threats, invariably arouse in the state rulers, their maximum efforts, and maximum propaganda among the people. As stated above, any way must always be used to mobilize the people to come to the state's defense in the belief that they are defending themselves. The fallacy of the idea becomes evident when conscription is wielded against those who refuse to, quote, defend themselves and are therefore forced into joining the state's military band. Needless to add, no, quote, defense is permitted them against the act of, quote, their own state. In war, state power is pushed to its ultimate, and under the slogans of defense and emergency, it can impose a tyranny upon the public such as might be openly resisted in time of peace. War thus provides many benefits to a state, and indeed every modern war has brought to the warring peoples a permanent legacy of increased state burdens upon society. War, moreover, provides to a state tempting opportunities for conquest of land areas over which it may exercise its monopoly of force. Randolph Bourne was certainly correct when he wrote that, quote, war is the health of the state, end quote. But to any particular state, a war may spell either health or grave injury. We may test the hypothesis that the state is largely interested in protecting itself rather than its subjects by asking, which category of crimes does the state pursue and punish most intensely? Those against private citizens or those against itself? The gravest crimes in the state's lexicon are almost invariably not invasions of private person or property, but dangers to its own contentment. For example, treason, desertion of the soldiers to the enemy, failure to register for the draft, subversion and subversive conspiracy, assassination of rulers, and such economic crimes against the state as counterfeiting its money or evasion of its income tax. Or compare the degree of zeal devoted to pursuing the man who assaults a policeman with the attention that the state pays to the assault of an ordinary citizen. Yet, curiously, the state's openly assigned priority to its own defense against the public strikes few people as inconsistent with its presumed raison d'etre. Next section. How states relate to one another. Since the territorial area of the earth is divided among different states, interstate relations must occupy much of the state's time and energy. The natural tendency of a state is to expand its power, and externally such expansion takes place by conquest of a territorial area. Unless a territory is stateless or uninhabited, any such expansion involves an inherent conflict of interest between one set of state rulers and another. Only one set of rulers can obtain a monopoly of coercion over any given territorial area at any one time. Complete power over a territory by state X can only be obtained by the expulsion of state Y. War, while risky, will be an ever-present tendency of states, punctuated by periods of peace and by shifting alliances and coalitions between states. We have seen that the internal or domestic attempt to limit the state in the 17th through 19th centuries reached its most notable form in constitutionalism. Its external or foreign affairs counterpart was the development of, quote, international law, especially such forms as the, quote, laws of war and, quote, neutrals' rights. Parts of international law were originally purely private, growing out of the need of merchants and traders everywhere to protect their property and adjudicate disputes. Examples are admiralty law and the law merchant. But even the governmental rules emerged voluntarily and were not imposed by any international superstate. The object of the laws of war was to limit interstate destruction to the state apparatus itself, thereby preserving the innocent, quote, civilian public from the slaughter and devastation of war. The object of the development of neutrals' rights was to preserve private civilian international commerce, even with, quote, enemy countries, from seizure by one of the warring parties. The overriding aim, then, was to limit the extent of any war, and particularly to limit its destructive impact on the private citizens of the neutral and even the warring countries. The jurist F.J.P. Veal charmingly describes such, quote, civilized warfare as it briefly flourished in 15th century Italy. Quote, the rich burghers and merchants of medieval Italy were too busy making money and enjoying life to undertake the hardships and dangers of soldiering themselves. So they adopted the practice of hiring mercenaries to do their fighting for them. And being thrifty, businesslike folk, they dismissed their mercenaries immediately after their services could be dispersed with. Wars were therefore fought by armies hired for each campaign. For the first time, soldiering became a reasonable and comparatively harmless profession. The generals of the period maneuvered against each other, often with consummate skill, but when one had won the advantage, his opponent generally either retreated or surrendered. It was a recognized rule that a town could only be sacked if it offered resistance. Immunity could always be purchased by paying a ransom. As one natural consequence, no town ever resisted, it being obvious that a government too weak to defend its citizens had forfeited their allegiance. Civilians had little to fear from the dangers of war, which were the concern only of professional soldiers. End quote. The well-nigh absolute separation of the private civilian from the state's war in 18th century Europe is highlighted by Neff. Quote, even postal communications were not successfully restricted for long in wartime. Letters circulated without censorship, with a freedom that astonishes the 20th century mind. The subjects of two warring nations talked to each other if they met, and when they could not meet, corresponded not as enemies but as friends. the modern notion hardly existed that subjects of any enemy country are partly accountable for the belligerent acts of their rulers. Nor had the warring rulers any firm disposition to stop communications with subjects of the enemy. The old inquisitorial practices of espionage in connection with religious worship and belief were disappearing, and no comparable inquisition in connection with political or economic communications was even contemplated. Passports were originally created to provide safe conduct in time of war. During most of the 18th century, it seldom occurred to Europeans to abandon their travels in a foreign country which their own was fighting. End quote. And trade being increasingly recognized as beneficial to both parties, 18th century warfare also counterbalances a considerable amount of, quote, trading with the enemy. How far states have transcended rules of civilized warfare in this century needs no elaboration here. In the modern era of total war, combined with the technology of total destruction, the very idea of keeping war limited to the state apparati seems even more quaint and obsolete than the original Constitution of the United States. When states are not at war, agreements are often necessary to keep friction at a minimum. One doctrine that has gained curiously wide acceptance is the alleged, quote, sanctity of treaties. But a treaty and a genuine contract have nothing in common. A contract transfers in a precise manner titles to private property. Since a government does not, in any proper sense, quote, own its territorial area, any agreements that it concludes do not confer titles to property. If, for example, Mr. Jones sells or gives his land to Mr. Smith, Jones's heir cannot legitimately descend upon Smith's heir and claim the land as rightfully his. The property title has already been transferred. Old Jones's contract is automatically binding upon young Jones, because the former had already transferred the property. Young Jones, therefore, has no property claim. Young Jones can only claim that which he has inherited from Old Jones, and Old Jones can only bequeath property which he still owns. But if, at a certain date, the government of, say, Ruritania is coerced or even bribed by the government of Moldavia into giving up some of its territory, it is absurd to claim that the governments or inhabitants of the two countries are forever barred from a claim to reunification of Ruritania on the grounds of the sanctity of a treaty. Neither the people nor the lands of northwest Ruritania are owned by either of the two governments. As a corollary, one government can certainly not bind, by the dead hand of the past, a later government through treaty. A revolutionary government which overthrew the king of Ruritania could similarly hardly be called to account for the king's actions or debts. For a government is not, as is a child, a true, quote, heir to its predecessor's property. And we'll finish at the conclusion of that section, about 3/4 of the way down, on page 302, reading about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we'll see you back hopefully tomorrow for the conclusion of Murray Rothbard's essay. Bye-bye.